Hello and welcome to Kansas Week. My name is Tim Brown. Kansas was host to at least 20 of the taxpayer tea parties this week. Organizers say they're tired of taxes and government spending increasing, but others characterize the protests as astroturfing, or false grassroots efforts that were actually orchestrated by large conservative organizations to target the president. We'll hear from a frequent guest of the show and one of the local organizers in just a moment. It's Tea Party time. More than 1,000 people showed up for a taxpayer protest in Wichita on tax day. Some estimates are even putting that number as high as 2,000. I spoke with conservative political blogger and a frequent guest on the show, Bob Weeks, about the protest.
I want to start by thanking all of the people who said, we need a tea party and we're willing to make this happen.
They called it a taxpayer tea party, a protest against the government's spending and tax plan. This rally in Wichita was one of several across the state. Bob Weeks of WichitaLiberty.org was one of the organizers of the event.
Well, I think it was a chance for people to express some of the frustration that they've had, not only with the events since President Obama was inaugurated, but the events that really started last fall with the bailouts and the stimulus and just the successive spending. Spending is really one of the key themes that people express frustration about at these tea parties. And so they started back in February. We had one the last Friday in February in Wichita. About 100 people came out on a very cold and windy day, and that led us to think forward to Tax Day along with the nationwide effort and to plan kind of a bigger celebration or protest, I should say, here in Wichita.
Weeks says the tea parties aren't just about taxes, but may actually be more focused on government spending.
That's one of the things, Tim, a lot of the critics of these tea parties have pointed out, well, the president just passed a tax cut for middle class Americans. I think he said 95% of Americans will pay less tax. So people saying, well, why are you protesting less taxes? And the answer is, well, like you said, spending is a big part of it as well. And we recognize that, and the Tea Party protesters recognize that when the government spends money but doesn't match it with tax revenue, that something has to happen sometime, that people in the future are going to be taxed. And a lot of the signs you saw at the protest were about you're taxing away my children or grandchildren's college fund and things like that. There's definitely a recognition that the spending is a big problem.
Some of the attendees of the rally are very much opposed to President Obama's policies, but others say the spending issues didn't just happen with this administration.
It's true that spending really bloomed under George Bush also as well. Matter of fact, there were some comparisons that compared him to some presidents that we think of big spenders like Lyndon Johnson, and Bush actually, as far as discretionary spending, outpaced even Lyndon Johnson in the Great Society days. So yes, spending has been increasing rapidly for a long time, but really since we've had the bailouts and the stimulus plans, it's really just increased exponentially. And so I think it's kind of past a tipping point or some sort of point where people are really starting to realize that this level of spending is not sustainable for very long at all.
One of the concerns for the Tea Party organizers is the president's promise to cut spending in the future and how realistic they believe that promise might be.
I think so. I think the less spending and less taxation are big themes. There's a bit of the spirit of the American Revolution alive there about freedom and liberty. Those themes play a role as well. For me, Tim, one of the things I worry about is that, we have this accelerated level of spending for the next year or two to bring us out of a depression or recession. At least hopefully that will happen. But once these constituencies that benefit from this spending get established, it's very difficult to get rid of them. So if we do come out of this recession in a couple years or whenever it is, and the president says, if he says, now we need to cut back on spending, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish that. So I really fear that this level of spending is something that is now part of the baseline for forever more in the future.
One of the biggest criticisms of the Tea Parties and their organizers is the accusation that the protests were not started as a grassroots effort and the people involved were being manipulated by conservative organizations.
There's a term for that. The leftists call it astroturfing. Astroturf being fake grass, so they think that these are fake grass roots. And it is true that some organizations have, with nationwide presence like Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works, have come in and started working with these tea parties. But, we're really grateful for them, and I think the support and the organizational skills that institutions like that can bring. But I don't feel So I didn't see anybody, Tim, that thinks that they're being used or that they're being duped into coming out and protesting something just to benefit a bunch of Republican politicians. As a matter of fact, in Chicago, Michael Steele, our new Republican national chairman, asked to speak, and he was turned down. So it's not really a Republican thing at all. Here in Wichita, I know a reporter from Channel 3, I'm sorry, he did an informal poll of people coming in, and he asked 100 people, what is your affiliation? He got 46 Republicans, 26 Democrats, 18 independents, and 10 libertarians. So Republicans didn't even make up a majority of those there, at least according to that sampling of 100 people.
But the question remains, why weren't there protests when George Bush was president and government and deficit were growing at record rates?
Well, that's a good question, Tim. I don't know if I really have an answer for it, but I think it is the fact that there is a new administration now, and there's no doubt that that motivates people who are opposed to Democrats, so that would be Republicans, Libertarians, Constitution Party people, and maybe some independents. There's also the fact that even though we talked about the increasing spending under President Bush, it's just way out over the top now with President Obama.
The effort in Wichita had quite a crowd, as did protests at other sites.
For people who passed through the registration table and checked in, about 2,000 in Wichita, and of course there may have been more people there. In Topeka, 1,500, Overland Park, 5,000. We think in Kansas that there were about 20 sites that held tea parties and about 16,000 people who attended those. Nationwide, the Christian Science Monitor reported about 700 sites with about 100,000 people altogether.
But what was accomplished by the tea parties?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I think there's a lot of people who are motivated and enthused right now, and there are some groups who are doing after-party outreach programs. For example, a group called American Majority, their specialty is training not only candidates but citizen activists as well. And they have some specific after Tea Party outreach programs to try to contact these people and let them know that there are resources there to help us in the future. And Americans for Prosperity as well as another organization that is a grassroots organization and would very much like to facilitate citizen activists as they continue on the spirit. There's talk about events that may happen in the summertime, perhaps associated with Independence Day, so these things may happen additional times this year as well.
That was Bob Weeks, and of course Bob is a frequent guest on the program. He is a blogger, wichitaliberty.org, and a very conservative blogger at that. Somebody who's not a conservative blogger is Mel Kahn.